In the spring of 2026, if everything goes to plan, 4 human beings are going to strap into a capsule on top of the most powerful rocket ever built and do something that no living person has ever witnessed. They are going to leave Earth orbit, not circle it, not visit the space station, not perform a beautiful high-altitude parabola and come home. They are going to break free of the gravitational loop that has confined every human being in space for the last 52 years and travel to the moon. Not land, just go there, swing around it, come back. And that's the sentence that makes it sound boring. That's the sentence that makes it feel like a lesser achievement, like a warm-up act before the real show. A moon flyby. So what? Here's what. The $20 billion that has been spent getting to this moment, on the rocket, on the capsule, on the ground systems, on 52 years of institutional dormancy, and then 52 years of trying to restart what was lost, is not really about the moon. It's about whether humanity can do this again, whether the infrastructure, the institutional knowledge, the political will, and the human courage to send people beyond Earth orbit can be rebuilt from scratch after half a century of atrophy. Whether the chain of capability that ran from Mercury to Gemini to Apollo, from one step to the next to the moon, can be reconstructed in an era of competing priorities, commercial disruption, geopolitical pressure, and a cost structure that makes the original Apollo program look like a garage project. The Artemis II mission is the answer to that question. The mission itself is not the point. The mission is the test. And the thing that makes it genuinely thrilling, the thing that the press releases and the official communications consistently fail to convey, is that the test is not certain to pass. This mission, on this rocket, in this capsule, with these 4 people, after everything that happened with the heat shield on, the first uncrewed flight after 17 years of development and 3 administrator regimes and 4 presidents and budget cycles that stretched and compressed the program like a rubber band. This mission is not a formality. It is the hardest thing NASA has attempted in half a century, and the outcome is not predetermined. Let's talk about what it actually is. Chapter 1. The architecture of a moon mission. What going to the moon actually takes most people, if asked how you get to the moon, would describe something vaguely like a rocket launch, followed by a long coast through space, followed by the moon. And that is roughly right. The way that you heat some water and mix it with things is roughly right about how to cook. The actual process is a sequence of precisely timed maneuvers, each depending on the success of the last, in an environment where any single failure has consequences that are not merely expensive, but potentially lethal. The Artemis II mission begins with the Space Launch System, SLS, a rocket that stands 98 meters tall, weighs approximately 2.7 million kilograms fully fueled, and produces 8.8 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. That thrust figure matters because it exceeds the Saturn V, the legendary Apollo-era rocket that remains, in the popular imagination, the benchmark of serious launch capability. The Saturn V produced 7.9 million pounds of thrust. The SLS produces more. It is, by this measure, the most powerful rocket ever successfully flown. The SLS has 4 main engines on its core stage, RS-25 engines, the same engines that flew on the space shuttle for 30 years, refurbished and modified for this application. Flanking the core stage are two solid rocket boosters, each 54 meters tall, each containing approximately 700,000 kilograms of solid propellant. The solid boosters burn for approximately 2 minutes, providing 75% of the total liftoff thrust, and then separate and fall into the ocean. The core stage continues burning until propellant depletion, approximately 8 minutes after launch, and then also falls away. The sequence of these separations is not just dramatic, it is structurally load critical. Each separation event changes the mass and aerodynamic profile of the ascending vehicle, and each must occur within tight timing and force parameters to prevent structural damage or loss of control. These are moments of violence, explosive bolts firing, pneumatic separation systems actuating, happening at supersonic velocities in the upper atmosphere, while the crew is experiencing several times the force of gravity. After the core stage separates, the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, ICPS, essentially a modified version of the Delta IV upper stage, puts Orion into a temporary parking orbit. This orbit is elliptical, ranging from roughly 30 kilometers at its lowest point to about 1,800 kilometers at its highest. The crew spends several hours in this orbit, running through a comprehensive checklist of every system on the spacecraft. Life support, pressurization, thermal control loop temperatures, communications link quality, reaction control system thruster response, computer system integrity. The checklist is not a formality. It is the go/no-go moment. Every mission-critical system must be verified within its nominal parameters before the crew can commit to the next burn. This commitment is irreversible in a specific and important sense. The translunar injection burn, the TLI burn, accelerates Orion from its parking orbit velocity of roughly 7.8 kilometers per second to approximately 10.9 kilometers per second, enough to break free of Earth's gravity and follow a trajectory to the moon. Once the TLI burn fires, the crew is committed to the lunar trajectory. There is no comfortable orbit to retreat to. The options narrow: continue to the moon or execute an abort trajectory that returns them to Earth. But the abort trajectories available change as the mission progresses, and some abort options require engine burns that themselves carry risk. The TLI burn lasts approximately 5 minutes and 40 seconds. In those 5 minutes and 40 seconds, the ICPS expends most of its remaining propellant. The burn concludes with separation. The ICPS falls away, Orion is alone, and the crew is now on a path to the moon that no human has traveled in 52 years. The transit takes approximately 3 days. During this time, the crew is not simply passengers. They are monitoring a spacecraft that is operating at the edge of its flight test envelope. Artemis II is only the second flight of Orion, and the second flight of any spacecraft is always when you find the things the first flight didn't reveal. Orion is designed to be monitored continuously, its systems reporting telemetry to mission control at Johnson Space Center in Houston through the Deep Space Network, the global system of large dish antennas that provides communication coverage for deep space missions. The DSN antenna at Goldstone, California, the antenna at Madrid, Spain, and the antenna at Canberra, Australia, together provide nearly continuous coverage. When Earth's rotation takes one antenna out of view of the spacecraft, another comes into view. At the Moon, Artemis II performs what NASA calls a hybrid free return trajectory, a path that carries Orion around the far side of the Moon without entering lunar orbit, using the Moon's gravity to redirect the spacecraft back toward Earth. The free return property of this trajectory means that if all propulsion fails after the lunar flyby, Orion will return to Earth on a natural, gravitational path without requiring any additional engine burns. This is a deliberate safety feature. The Apollo 13 mission survived its crippling explosion in part because the crew was near enough to a free return trajectory that they could use it as an escape route. Artemis II is designed to have this escape route available as a primary option. The closest approach to the Moon, the moment of maximum distance from Earth, will put the crew approximately 370,000 kilometers from home. No human being has been that far from Earth since December 1972. When the crew looks out of Orion's windows at closest approach, they will see the lunar surface at a scale that no living human being has seen outside of archive photographs. They will be on the far side of the Moon, out of radio contact with Earth, in a silence that is not metaphorical but physical. A radio blackout caused by the Moon's bulk, blocking every frequency of electromagnetic radiation from the Earth-based antennas. That silence lasts approximately 25 minutes. Then the spacecraft emerges from behind the Moon. The antennas reacquire the signal, and the long coast home begins. The return transit is 3 more days, then re-entry. Orion hits the upper atmosphere at approximately 39,500 kilometers per hour, decelerating from orbital velocity to parachute deployment velocity in approximately 15 minutes, with the heat shield absorbing the conversion of kinetic energy to heat. Temperatures at the stagnation point reaching close to 2,800 degrees Celsius. The parachutes deploy in sequence, drogue parachutes first to stabilize the capsule, then main parachutes, 3 of them, each 35 meters in diameter, to slow the descent. Splashdown in the Pacific Ocean, recovery by the USS San Diego and a team of Navy divers. 10 days, start to finish, from Kennedy Space Center launch pad to Pacific Ocean recovery. This is the mission. Every element has been designed, tested, and validated to the extent that engineering can validate a system before it actually flies with humans aboard, which is not to a perfect extent, which is never to a perfect extent, which is why Artemis II is both necessary and genuinely dangerous. Chapter 2: The Orion Capsule, 50 years of learning in one machine. The Orion spacecraft is the product of a specific lesson that NASA learned from the space shuttle at an enormous price. The shuttle was a magnificent machine in many ways. It could carry large payloads to orbit, deploy and retrieve satellites, service the Hubble Space Telescope, assemble the International Space Station. It was versatile in ways that no spacecraft before or since has matched, but it had a structural vulnerability that, in retrospect, should have been addressed and was not. The crew rode alongside the stack rather than on top of it, which meant that debris from the external tank or solid rocket boosters, traveling at high velocity relative to the vehicle, could strike the heat shield on the underside of the orbiter, where it could not be inspected from the crew cabin, and where the consequences were catastrophic. This is what killed Columbia on February 1st, 2003. A piece of foam insulation from the external tank struck the left wing's reinforced carbon-carbon leading edge during launch. The crew had no way of knowing. 16 days later, during re-entry, the damaged wing structure failed. Orion is designed around a different philosophy. The crew capsule sits at the top of the rocket, separated from any potential source of debris. The launch abort system sits above the crew capsule, capable of pulling the capsule away from the rocket at any point from the launch pad through the first stage of ascent. This puts the crew in the safest possible position relative to the launch vehicle. The same philosophy that governed the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo capsules, and which was abandoned with the shuttle for reasons that were primarily about payload capacity and reusability rather than crew safety. The Orion crew module is 5.03 meters in diameter, larger than the Apollo command module, with a pressurized volume of approximately 8.95 cubic meters for 4 crew members over 10 days. That is not luxurious. It is about the interior space of a large minivan, and unlike a minivan, it cannot be parked and the crew cannot get out. The furniture is functional and minimal. 4 seats with restraint systems for high G phases, sleeping arrangements that involve tethered sleep stations rather than beds, a small galley for food preparation, and a bathroom system that is one of the most thoughtfully engineered components on the spacecraft. Because nothing degrades crew performance and morale faster than a malfunctioning waste management system. The spacecraft's primary structure is an aluminum-lithium alloy, lighter than standard aluminum with comparable strength. The heat shield, the most critical single component, uses AVCOAT, an ablative material that burns away during re-entry, absorbing heat in the process. The AVCOAT tiles are applied to a fiberglass honeycomb substrate, and the total heat shield assembly on Orion is 5 meters in diameter, the largest ablative heat shield ever flown on a crewed spacecraft. The choice of AVCOAT was a deliberate return to Apollo heritage. The same basic material that protected the Apollo command module, combined with updated manufacturing processes and modern understanding of the aerothermal environment. The European service module, bolted to the bottom of the crew module, provides the propulsion, power, and consumables that the crew module cannot supply on its own. The ESM is the European Space Agency's primary contribution to the Artemis program, and it represents a departure from the historical pattern of European participation in NASA human spaceflight, which had been primarily confined to the International Space Station. The ESM contains the main engine, a modified version of the engine used on the Space Shuttle Orbital Maneuvering System, capable of 26.7 kilonewtons of thrust for major trajectory corrections. It carries 8,600 kilograms of propellant. Its 4 deployable solar arrays, each 7 meters long, generate up to 11.2 kilowatts of electrical power, which is more than the spacecraft requires in normal operations, but provides margin for contingencies. The avionics represent the greatest technological leap from the Apollo era to Artemis. Apollo relied on a custom-built computer with 4 kilobytes of RAM and 32 kilobytes of read-only memory. A computer that the crew could interact with only through a keyboard and a small display showing numerical codes. Orion uses a distributed computing architecture with multiple redundant processors, touchscreen displays derived from commercial aviation technology, and software systems that can handle the full navigation, guidance, and control functions autonomously. The crew can monitor and override any automated function, but in normal operations, they are supervising a spacecraft that flies itself. Navigation uses a combination of inertial measurement units, gyroscopes and accelerometers that track the spacecraft's acceleration and rotation and integrate these to determine position and velocity, and star trackers, cameras that compare the positions of observed stars to an onboard catalog to determine the spacecraft's orientation with extraordinary precision. In the Apollo era, one of the crew's primary tasks was celestial navigation, sighting stars through a sextant to update the computer's knowledge of the spacecraft's position. In Artemis, this is automated. The crew can perform manual celestial navigation checks, and they train to do so, but the primary navigation is handled by the computers. Life support is provided by an environmental control and life support system that maintains cabin pressure at a nitrogen-oxygen mix approximating sea level atmospheric composition, controls temperature and humidity, removes carbon dioxide and trace contaminants from the cabin air through chemical absorbers and filters, and manages the water supply for drinking, food preparation, and personal hygiene. The ECLSS is designed for a maximum mission duration of 21 days, but carries consumables for 30 days, providing a 50% margin against extended missions caused by contingencies. Before getting to the abort capability, it is worth dwelling on one aspect of Orion's design that rarely receives the attention it deserves: radiation shielding. The crew of Artemis II will be beyond the protection of Earth's magnetic field for 10 days. Inside the Van Allen belts and inside the magnetosphere broadly, Earth's magnetic field deflects most of the charged particle radiation that would otherwise reach the spacecraft. Beyond the magnetosphere, in deep space at lunar distances, there is no such deflection. The galactic cosmic rays that permeate the galaxy, accelerated to near-light speeds by supernova shockwaves and other energetic events, arrive at the spacecraft from all directions. Solar energetic particles, protons and heavier ions, released by solar flares and coronal mass ejections, can arrive suddenly and with intensities that would be dangerous without shielding. Orion's primary radiation shielding is provided by the structure of the spacecraft itself, combined with the strategic placement of the water supplies for the crew. Water is an excellent radiation moderator. The hydrogen nuclei in water molecules are effective at slowing and absorbing the secondary particles produced when primary cosmic rays interact with the spacecraft structure. The sleeping areas and the most heavily used crew stations are positioned as much as possible in the regions of the spacecraft where the water stores and other hydrogen-rich materials provide the most shielding. There is also a storm shelter concept for solar energetic particle events, a region of the spacecraft where the crew can shelter during a solar storm, surrounded by the maximum available mass of material to minimize their dose. This shelter is not a specialized room. It is a configuration of the crew's sleeping arrangement that maximizes the material between the crew and the incoming radiation direction. The crew monitors space weather forecasts throughout the mission and Mission Control at Houston continuously tracks solar activity. If a solar energetic particle event is predicted, the crew can adopt the shelter configuration before the event arrives. The expected radiation dose for Artemis II is within the acceptable limits established by NASA's radiation exposure standards. These standards are set based on statistical analyses of cancer risk. They establish an additional cancer risk limit above the baseline that is considered acceptable for astronauts, given their other occupational risks. The 10-day duration of Artemis II means the cumulative dose is manageable. Longer missions, the surface operations of Artemis III, or eventual long-duration stays at the Lunar Gateway, will accumulate higher doses and will require more sophisticated radiation management. One system on Orion that deserves attention because it is genuinely novel relative to previous crewed spacecraft is the integrated abort capability. Every crewed spacecraft has some form of abort capability, but Orion's is more comprehensive than most. During the launch phase, the launch abort system, a tower above the crew module containing solid-fueled motors, can pull the crew module away from the rocket in approximately 1.8 seconds, accelerating the capsule from 0 to hundreds of kilometers per hour and to a safe altitude before the parachutes deploy. This abort capability extends through the solid rocket booster phase and into the first portion of the core stage burn. After the abort system is jettisoned, which happens well before the spacecraft reaches orbit, once the crew is safely beyond the phase where launch abort is the primary escape option, the service module's main engine becomes the primary abort propulsion. In the event of a catastrophic failure during the translunar transit, the service module can perform a burn to redirect the spacecraft onto a return trajectory. Orion is not a perfect machine. No spacecraft ever built for human use has been perfect. But it is the product of 50 years of accumulated knowledge about what kills astronauts and how to prevent it, embodied in engineering choices that run through every system on the vehicle. Chapter 3: The crew that will fly it and what they represent. On April 3, 2023, NASA Administrator Bill Nelson walked to a podium at Johnson Space Center in Houston and introduced 4 people to the world. The announcement was choreographed. The NASA press conference playbook for crew announcements has not changed much since the Mercury 7, but what he said was genuinely historic. Commander Reed Wiseman, Pilot Victor Glover, Mission Specialists Christina Koch and Jeremy Hansen. Let me tell you what that list of names actually means. Victor Glover is going to be the first Black astronaut to fly beyond low Earth orbit. This is not a detail. This is not a footnote. It is the single most significant statement about the demography of deep space exploration since the program began. The United States has been sending humans to space since 1961. In 65 years of American human spaceflight, through Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, Skylab, the Shuttle, the International Space Station, no Black American has ever traveled beyond the 400-kilometer shell of low Earth orbit. Glover is going to change that. He is going to be 370,000 kilometers from Earth, farther than any Black human being in history. And that matters not just symbolically, but practically, because the people who decide whether space is for them look at the people who go and make that calculation in real time. Glover is 47 years old, a U.S. Navy pilot, a graduate of California Polytechnic State University, and 3 graduate institutions in aerospace and military science. He flew to the International Space Station in November 2020 as the pilot of Crew Dragon Crew 1, the first operational crewed flight of that vehicle, and spent 168 days aboard before returning. He is technically exceptional, which is why he is on this crew, and he is personally compelling in ways that matter for what this mission represents. Christina Koch is going to be the first woman to travel to the moon. She already holds the record for the longest single spaceflight by a woman. 328 days on the International Space Station from March 2019 to February 2020. During that mission, she and astronaut Jessica Meir performed the first all-female spacewalk in history, a milestone that was explicitly planned by NASA in recognition that having only male spacewalkers in the 21st century was an embarrassment that needed to be corrected. Koch is 45, an electrical engineer, a former Peace Corps volunteer, a former researcher at the Antarctic Scientific Station at the geographic South Pole. She has lived and worked in some of the most isolated and extreme environments on Earth before going to one of the most extreme environments in the cosmos. On Artemis II, she is going to the moon. She is going to be the first woman to see it from 8,900 kilometers. Jeremy Hansen is a Canadian Space Agency astronaut and a colonel in the Royal Canadian Air Force. He is 48, a CF-18 fighter pilot by training, and Artemis II will be his first space flight. He is going to be the first non-American to fly beyond low Earth orbit. Not a Russian, not a European, not a Japanese astronaut, but a Canadian. Canada has contributed enormously to human spaceflight through the Canadarm robotic systems and through the 6 Canadian astronauts who have flown on the shuttle and the ISS. But none of them has gone farther than the space station. Hansen will go to the moon. Reed Wiseman, the commander, is 48, a U.S. Navy test pilot and NASA astronaut who previously flew a 167-day mission to the ISS in 2014 and performed 2 spacewalks. He is the experienced hand on the crew. The Fu, commander in the technical sense, responsible for the decisions that matter most under pressure. With the background of a test pilot who has spent his career evaluating new vehicles in conditions where getting it wrong has fatal consequences. These 4 people know what they are signing up for. They have been briefed on every anomaly, every uncertainty, every residual risk that the engineering team has identified. They are test pilots and mission specialists by training, which means their professional identity is built around understanding risk at a quantitative level and making informed decisions about acceptable exposure. They are not naive, and they are not reckless. They have decided with full information that this mission is worth doing. There is something important about that decision that tends to get lost in coverage of spaceflight that focuses on the hardware and the costs and the politics. 4 human beings who understand exactly how the heat shield on this spacecraft behaved unexpectedly on its first flight, who understand exactly what it would mean if the heat shield fails during their re-entry, have decided to get in the capsule anyway. That decision deserves to be honored by understanding what they are getting into. Chapter 4, the $20 billion question: where the money actually went. The $20 billion figure in this video's title needs context because the number is both accurate and potentially misleading depending on what you include. The approximately $20 billion figure represents the combined development cost of the Orion spacecraft and the exploration ground systems, the launch infrastructure at Kennedy Space Center, through approximately 2025. The Orion program alone has cost approximately $20.7 billion from program inception through its first 2 flights, according to the NASA Office of Inspector General's accounting. If you add the Space Launch System development costs separately, approximately $23 billion, the total development cost of the launch and crew vehicle system is closer to $43 billion. And if you add the human landing system, the lunar gateway, and the cost of operating the program, the Inspector General's total for conducting the first Artemis crewed lunar landing reaches approximately $93 billion. But the $20 billion framing for this video is specifically appropriate because it captures the cost of the thing that is being demonstrated by Artemis II, the Orion spacecraft and the ground infrastructure needed to launch it. The rocket adds more cost, the lander adds more, the station adds more. But Artemis II is about Orion, about whether Orion can safely carry humans to the moon and bring them back. And the cost of Orion is approximately $20 billion. That $20 billion has bought several specific things. It has bought a crew capsule that is designed to keep 4 people alive for 21 days in an environment that kills without protection. It has bought a heat shield that is rated for the thermal environment of lunar return, surface temperatures approaching 2,800 degrees Celsius, for which no material survives intact, but Avcoat survives by burning. It has bought a launch abort system that can pull the crew away from an exploding rocket in any scenario, from the launch pad through the ascent phase. It has bought 21 years of engineering, testing, redesign, program cancellation, program restart, redesign again, test campaigns, thermal vacuum testing, water impact testing, vibration testing, electromagnetic interference testing, and the slow accumulation of validated confidence in a machine that has never carried humans before. It has also, to be honest, bought some things that are harder to defend in cost-benefit terms. The Orion program was originally conceived in 2004 under the Constellation program, cancelled in 2010, substantially redesigned, and restarted under the Artemis program in 2019. Each cancellation and restart costs money that produces no flight hardware. It costs money to stop a program, and it costs money to restart one. The engineering teams that are broken up and dispersed when a program is cancelled don't simply reassemble when the program restarts. Key people move to other jobs. Institutional knowledge is lost. New people have to be hired and trained. The disruptions of the Bush to Obama transition and the Obama to Trump transition in space policy each cost the Orion program years and hundreds of millions of dollars that produced nothing but bureaucratic continuity. The cost-plus contract structure that governs the Orion program, in which Lockheed Martin, the prime contractor, is paid its costs plus a negotiated fee regardless of whether it delivers efficiently, removes the financial incentive to build the spacecraft efficiently. Lockheed Martin builds Orion to specification. When the specification changes, as it has many times, the cost increases, the fee adjusts, and the program continues. The Inspector General has identified cost-plus contracting as a primary driver of cost growth across NASA's human spaceflight programs. These structural cost drivers, the political disruptions, the cost-plus contracting, the lack of competitive pressure in prime contracting for a government monopoly program, explain a significant portion of the gap between what Orion might have cost under different institutional arrangements and what it actually cost. The rest of the gap is genuine engineering complexity. The Orion spacecraft is attempting something genuinely hard in an environment that is genuinely hostile, with safety requirements that are genuinely demanding. The relevant comparison is not with other government space programs where the same cost drivers apply. It is with what commercial development of comparable systems has produced. The SpaceX Dragon capsule, which has been flying crews to the ISS since 2020, was developed for a total cost of approximately $2.6 billion under NASA's Commercial Crew Program, which used fixed-price contracts rather than cost-plus. Dragon is not equivalent to Orion. It is designed for low Earth orbit missions, not lunar return. But the cost comparison illustrates what different procurement approaches produce. Orion's capability beyond LEO justifies some additional cost. 20 times the cost is harder to justify on those grounds alone. The honest assessment is this: the $20 billion is not entirely wasted money. It is money that has been converted into a real spacecraft that will fly a real crew to the vicinity of the moon. But it is also money that reflects institutional dysfunction, political disruption, and procurement practices that are suboptimal by any standard. Understanding both of those things simultaneously is the only accurate way to understand what the $20 billion has bought. Chapter 5: The Heat Shield. The crisis that almost wasn't talked about. In November and December 2022, the Artemis I mission flew and returned. The Orion spacecraft completed its uncrewed test flight around the moon, splashed down in the Pacific on December 11th, 2022, and was recovered by the USS Portland. NASA held a press conference and declared the mission a success. The mission had met all primary objectives. The SLS had flown. Orion had flown. The heat shield had protected the capsule through re-entry. What NASA did not say at that press conference, what became clear over the following months through Inspector General reports and congressional testimony, and the slow grinding gears of technical investigation, was that the heat shield had not performed as the models predicted. The AVCOAT ablative material on the Orion heat shield had experienced what engineers described as unexpected char loss patterns. This is the technical language for a specific type of failure mode. The char layer that forms as AVCOAT ablates during re-entry had, in some regions of the heat shield, cracked and ejected chunks of material rather than ablating smoothly in the uniform, progressive way that the models had predicted and that ground testing had produced. The cracking and ejection, charring followed by fracture and mass loss, was patchy and non-uniform. Some regions of the heat shield performed exactly as expected. Other regions showed this anomalous behavior. The immediate engineering question was, does this matter? The heat shield had not failed in the sense of breaching. The crew module was intact. and had there been crew aboard, they would have survived the re-entry. The thermal protection had been provided, even if not in the precisely predicted manner. So one could argue, and NASA's initial public communications did argue, that the performance was within limits. But the phrase within limits is doing a lot of work there. The limits in question were established by the models that predicted how the heat shield would behave. The models, it turned out, had not predicted what actually happened. The material failed in a mode that the models did not include, which means the limits are set by models that are wrong about at least one physical mechanism, and wrong in a way that was not identified until a real flight in the real aerothermal environment, with the real heating rates and heating profiles of a real lunar return trajectory. The Artemis I re-entry used a skip re-entry profile, a new technique in which the spacecraft dips into the upper atmosphere, creates lift aerodynamically, skips back out, and then makes a final plunge on a steeper trajectory. This technique allows the spacecraft to target a specific splashdown location with much greater precision than a direct re-entry, and it modulates the heating rate in a way that is supposed to reduce the peak heat flux. The skip is a planned feature of every Artemis mission. The working hypothesis that emerged from the investigation is that the skip re-entry profile creates a specific thermal loading history, heat is applied, then the spacecraft exits the atmosphere, and the heat shield cools somewhat. Then the final re-entry applies heat again, and this two-phase heating pattern may cause the char layer to behave differently than it does in a single continuous heating event. Ground testing of AVCOAT had been conducted with continuous heating profiles. The two-phase heating of the skip re-entry may not have been adequately reproduced in ground testing. The NASA Inspector General, in a report released in November 2023, used language that was notably sharper than NASA's official communications. The report stated that NASA did not communicate the full extent of the heat shield anomaly to external stakeholders in a timely fashion, and noted that the initial characterization of the anomaly as within limits was potentially misleading, because the limits had been established by models that the anomaly demonstrated were incomplete. The report also noted that the testing program for the heat shield had not been designed to reproduce the specific loading conditions of the skip re-entry profile, and recommended that this gap be addressed before the crewed mission. The congressional testimony that followed was more pointed still. Several engineers, speaking through prepared statements to the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee, characterized the anomaly in terms that contrasted sharply with the official within limits framing. One characterization described the char ejection events as representing a physical mechanism that was not in our models and that we did not test for. This is the engineering equivalent of saying, we did not know this was possible, and we only found out because it actually happened on the flight. The comparison to previous NASA safety failures was made explicitly in the Inspector General report, which drew a direct parallel to the pattern observed before both the Challenger and Columbia accidents. Technical anomaly observed and documented, characterized as acceptable or within limits, not fully disclosed to decision-makers and external stakeholders, and ultimately leading, in those cases, to catastrophic failure. The IG's point was not that Artemis II will fail. It was that the institutional pattern of minimizing anomaly severity in public communications has historically been a warning sign that deserves to be taken seriously independently of whether the specific anomaly is ultimately found to be dangerous. NASA's response to the heat shield investigation has been substantive. The program has identified trajectory modifications, adjustments to the skip angle and the re-entry heating profile that are intended to reduce the likelihood of the anomalous char behavior recurring. Engineering analysis of the heat shield material has been refined, with updated models that include the two-phase heating mechanism identified in the investigation. Orion 004, the crew module for Artemis II, has been built with a heat shield that incorporates manufacturing improvements relative to the Artemis I heat shield, based on lessons learned from the post-flight inspection. Artemis II will not fly until the team has satisfied itself, through a formal readiness review process, that the risk to the crew is within acceptable bounds. The formal process for making this determination involves the mission management team, the Flight Readiness Review Board, and ultimately the NASA administrator, who must sign off on the decision to fly a crewed mission. This process is the same one that was supposed to prevent Challenger and Columbia, the same review boards, the same decision authorities. The fact that the process failed in those cases does not mean it will fail in this case, but it does mean that the existence of the process is not the same thing as a guarantee. Chapter 6. The Race. Nobody expected to get this close. In 2019, when the Trump administration relaunched the Artemis program with a directive to land on the moon by 2024. The Chinese lunar program was an interesting but seemingly distant competitor. China had landed a rover on the moon in 2013, impressive, and was planning more ambitious missions. But the gap between an uncrewed rover and a crewed lunar landing is enormous, and most analysts rated China's 2030 crewed lunar landing ambitions as optimistic projections that would likely slip. 5 years later, the landscape looks different. The Chang'e 6 mission, which returned samples from the lunar far side in June 2024, the first far side sample return in history, demonstrated not just capability, but operational maturity. The Queqiao 2 relay satellite, launched in March 2024 to support the mission, worked flawlessly. The landing at the South Pole Aitken Basin, one of the most challenging and scientifically significant sites on the moon, was precise and successful. The sample canister returned to Inner Mongolia, carrying 1.9 kilograms of material from the far side. This was not a program that was fumbling its way toward an ambitious milestone. This was a program that was systematically executing a development roadmap and hitting its marks. The Chinese crewed lunar program has publicly committed to a 2030 target for landing taikonauts on the moon. The architecture involves 2 Long March 9 heavy-lift rockets, the rocket that is China's equivalent of the SLS, launching separately and rendezvousing in orbit, one carrying the crewed spacecraft, called Mengzhou, and one carrying the lunar lander, called Lanyu. The crew of 2 taikonauts would transfer to the lander, descend to the lunar surface, conduct operations, and return to the Mengzhou for the trip home. The Long March 9 has not yet flown. This is the largest single uncertainty in the Chinese timeline. Every major heavy-lift rocket in history, the Saturn V, the Shuttle, the SLS, has taken substantially longer to develop than the initial estimates predicted. If Long March 9 follows this pattern, the 2030 crewed landing target becomes 2032 or 2035 or later. But China has specific institutional advantages in this context. It does not negotiate its rocket development budget with a legislature annually. It does not face the kind of political disruption that canceled the American Constellation program and restarted it as Artemis. The institutional continuity of the Chinese space program, the ability to make a decision and sustain it across leadership transitions, is a genuine capability advantage in a domain where development timelines are measured in decades. The space race framing, US versus China, who gets to the moon first, is real but incomplete. The deeper competition is about who establishes the framework for long-term human presence in cislunar space, and that competition is about more than flags and footprints. The lunar South Pole contains water ice in permanently shadowed craters, ice that can be converted to water for crew use and to hydrogen and oxygen for rocket propellant, making it the most strategically important resource on the moon for a sustained presence. The nation that establishes the first operational base at the lunar South Pole will be in the strongest position to shape the practical norms and physical realities of lunar operations. This is why the schedule matters so much. A successful Artemis II in 2026, followed by a successful Artemis III in 2028 or 2029, establishes an American operational presence at the lunar South Pole before the likely window of the first Chinese crewed landing. A delayed Artemis II, pushed to 2027 or beyond, followed by continued development challenges on the human landing system, could compress or eliminate that window. The margin between being first and being second in this race is not large, and that margin is affected by everything that has gone wrong so far. The heat shield investigation, the Kyo SLS cost overruns, the schedule slips. India's Chandrayaan-3 mission successfully soft-landed near the lunar South Pole in August 2023, the first soft landing in that region by any nation. Japan's SLIM lander reached the moon in January 2024. Russia's Luna 25 failed at the South Pole in August 2023. The South Pole is becoming a destination, not just an aspiration, and the nations that are getting there and the order in which they do will define the political and practical reality of the next era of lunar exploration. Chapter 7: The New Architecture of Space. What's different? This time, the Apollo program was built by one organization, NASA, under contract from one government, the United States, using a workforce that was, at its peak in the mid-1960s, approximately 400,000 people spread across NASA and its contractors. It was a mobilization of national, industrial, and scientific capacity at a scale that has rarely been matched in peacetime. It succeeded because the goal was clear, the budget was unconstrained by modern standards, the timeline was urgent, and the political will was sustained for approximately a decade. The Artemis program is being built in a completely different institutional environment. The hardware is a combination of government-developed elements, the SLS, the Orion spacecraft, the Exploration Ground Systems, and commercial elements, including the Human Landing System, provided by SpaceX under a fixed-price contract, and eventually Blue Origin under a second Human Landing System contract. The international elements include the European Service Module, Canadarm3 for the Gateway, the JAXA-provided Lunar Cruiser rover, and the ESA International Habitat for the Gateway. The program involves 14 formal international partners through the Artemis Accords, with another 30 nations having signed the accords without formal program contributions. This architecture is both a strength and a complication. It is a strength because it distributes cost and capability across more contributors, because it builds an international coalition that has political value beyond the technical mission, and because the commercial elements, specifically SpaceX's Human Landing System, have introduced competitive pressure and cost discipline into at least one major program element. It is a complication because coordinating technical interfaces, schedule requirements, and risk management decisions across this many stakeholders, with different governance structures and different risk cultures, is genuinely hard, and the history of large international collaborative programs, scientific programs, defense programs, infrastructure programs, is a history of cost growth and schedule slippage that exceeds what any single participant can deliver alone. The commercial dimension of Artemis represents a structural shift in American human spaceflight that is permanent and transformative. The Commercial Crew Program, which brought SpaceX Dragon and Boeing Starliner into service for ISS transportation, demonstrated that commercial fixed-price contracting can develop spacecraft faster and cheaper than traditional cost-plus government contracting, at least in the case of SpaceX. The Human Landing System contract, which selected SpaceX's Starship at $2.89 billion for the first phase, has essentially outsourced the most complex and dangerous element of the lunar landing to a commercial company that was operating on the basis of its own investment in a vehicle that had not yet reached orbit at the time of the contract award. That bet has, so far, appeared to be paying off. Starship has made substantial development progress since 2021, achieving its first successful full-stack flight to orbit in 2024 and demonstrating the booster catch technology that is central to its reusability architecture. The development still has a long way to go. The crewed Starship Human Landing System variant has not yet flown, and the propellant transfer technology needed for the cislunar architecture has not been demonstrated in orbit. But the trajectory of the program has been more positive than many skeptics predicted. The contrast with Boeing's Starliner development is instructive. Boeing received approximately $4.2 billion under the Commercial Crew contract to develop Starliner, compared to SpaceX's $2.6 billion for Dragon. Starliner's first crewed orbital test flight in June 2024 encountered a series of thruster failures and a helium leak that kept astronauts Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams at the ISS for months longer than planned, while NASA evaluated the risks of a return flight. The spacecraft eventually returned uncrewed, with Wilmore and Williams repatriated via SpaceX Dragon, a commercial competitor. This outcome, a government-contracted spacecraft deemed too risky for crew return, crew rescued by a competitor's vehicle, is a vivid illustration of the risks and realities of the current commercial spaceflight landscape. The lesson is not that commercial development of crewed spacecraft is inherently risky. SpaceX's Dragon has been extraordinarily reliable. The lesson is that the outcome depends on execution, on the specific engineering decisions made, the testing philosophy adopted, the risk culture of the specific organization, and that neither the government label nor the commercial label is a guarantee of either safety or efficiency. For Artemis II specifically, the relevant commercial program is not Starship, but the Orion spacecraft itself, which is built by Lockheed Martin. And Lockheed Martin's Orion, unlike SpaceX's Dragon, was built under a cost-plus contract, with the cost and schedule performance that cost-plus contracting historically produces. The comparison is not flattering for the government procurement model, but Orion is what was built, and it is what will fly, and the question of whether the money was spent as efficiently as possible is now secondary to the question of whether the machine that was built is ready to fly with a crew. Chapter 8: The Day-by-Day Mission, Living Through 10 Days in Deep Space. The popular imagination of spaceflight tends to linger on the dramatic moments: the launch, the planetary approach, the splashdown. What gets far less attention is the middle, the long, quiet, technically demanding stretches between the drama, when the crew is living and working inside a machine smaller than a studio apartment, in an environment that will kill them if that machine fails in any of 100 ways, with no ability to step outside, no possibility of rescue from any direction, and the full weight of what they have committed to settling over them in the silence of deep space. Day 1 begins before launch. The crew wakes at the crew quarters at Kennedy Space Center approximately 6 hours before liftoff. They eat a pre-launch meal, undergo final medical checks, put on their launch and re-entry suits, the orange pressure suits that protect against cabin depressurization during the highest risk phases of flight, and proceed to the launch pad in the crew transportation vehicle, the same crew transfer van that has carried astronauts to their spacecraft since the Apollo era. The suit-up and walk-out process is public, filmed, and ritually familiar, even though it is genuinely not routine. The crew walking to the pad in their suits is walking toward something that could kill them, and the calm professionalism with which they do it is the product of years of training, in which they have practiced this moment many times. Boarding Orion takes approximately 2 hours. The crew members enter through the access hatch one by one, settle into their seats, and begin the pre-launch checklist, working through each system with the launch controllers at Kennedy, who are responsible for the groundside operations. The crew is strapped in, the hatch is sealed, and the countdown proceeds. During the final 2 hours of countdown, there are multiple built-in holds, planned pauses in the countdown that allow the launch team to catch up on any issues and maintain schedule flexibility. If a technical issue is detected that cannot be resolved within the hold period, the launch is scrubbed for that day. The launch itself is approximately 8.5 minutes of loud, violent, relentless acceleration. The crew experiences peak loads of approximately 4G during the solid rocket booster phase, 4 times the normal force of gravity, pressing them into their seats. The solid boosters separate at approximately 2 minutes and 6 seconds into flight. The core stage continues burning. At approximately 8 minutes, the core stage exhausts its propellant and separates. The ICPS puts Orion into the parking orbit. For the first time in 8.5 minutes, there is no engine thrust. The crew is in free fall, in orbit, weightless. The new hours in the parking orbit are the most critical pre-commitment phase of the mission. Every system on the spacecraft is checked against its nominal parameters. The crew pays particular attention to the life support system, the communications links with mission control, and the propulsion systems that will execute the TLI burn. If anything is outside its acceptable range, the mission management team in Houston can make the call to remain in the parking orbit for one orbit and try again, or to abort and return to Earth. This is not a decision that will be made lightly. It means accepting the cost and schedule impact of an aborted launch. But it is made with the full information available, and it is made before the crew is committed to the translunar trajectory. The TLI burn, if the go decision is made, converts the parking orbit into an escape trajectory in 5 minutes and 40 seconds. After the burn, the crew shifts from launch and re-entry suits into flight suits. Lighter, more comfortable, designed for the cruise phase of the mission, and begins the transition to the cruise timeline. The first day of transit to the moon is primarily about getting settled, configuring the cabin for long-duration operations, eating a real meal for the first time since breakfast before launch, running through the initial post-TLI systems status check, and communicating with mission control about any anomalies or concerns from the launch and orbital insertion phases. Day 2 through Day 3 are the cruise phase to the moon. But before getting into the cruise routine, it is worth describing the specific physical experience of the early hours of weightlessness, because it is one of the most disorienting and least glamorized aspects of spaceflight. The human vestibular system, the inner ear organs that provide the sense of balance and orientation, evolved in a gravitational environment. It is calibrated to detect the direction of gravity and to use that detection as the anchor for spatial orientation. Remove gravity, and the vestibular system initially reports contradictory information. The eyes say the world has a down, the floor of the capsule, but the inner ear reports no consistent gravitational direction. For most people, this mismatch produces nausea, sometimes severe, in the first 12 to 24 hours of weightlessness. This is space adaptation sickness, and it affects approximately 2/3 of astronauts during their first few hours in orbit, regardless of how experienced they are. The symptoms typically resolve within 24 to 48 hours as the brain learns to reinterpret the vestibular input in the absence of gravity and to rely more heavily on visual cues for orientation. But during those first hours, the crew is functioning at less than optimal performance, managing nausea, dealing with the fluid shift to the head that weightlessness causes, which makes the face feel congested and the voice slightly nasal, and which can cause a mild headache, and trying to get a grasp on the novel physical environment of the capsule. This context matters because the crew is not passengers watching the moon approach over the first 3 days. They are working people, managing their own physiological adaptation while simultaneously running a test program on a spacecraft. The transition from the adrenaline of launch to the daily rhythm of deep space operations requires a psychological and physical adjustment that takes at least a day, often more. Day 2 through day 3 are the crew's phase to the moon. The crew maintains a schedule structured around mission control's timeline. 8 hours of sleep, 16 hours of work and personal time. The work during the cruise includes daily physical exercise. The NASA exercise protocol for the mission calls for approximately 1 hour of aerobic exercise per day to maintain cardiovascular fitness, using a resistance exercise device and a cycle ergometer stowed in the cabin. Daily medical checks, communication with mission control, ongoing monitoring of spacecraft systems, and the specific test objectives assigned to the mission. The test objectives are not passive monitoring. The crew will perform specific maneuvers. Manual attitude control exercises in which the commander or pilot takes manual control of Orion and flies it through a series of attitude changes, evaluating how the fly-by-wire system responds to pilot inputs and how the vehicle behaves during manual operation. These exercises are planned not because manual control is expected to be necessary. In nominal operations, Orion flies itself, but because the crew needs to be able to take manual control in any contingency, and they need to have practiced with the actual flight vehicle, not just the simulator. The real vehicle always has subtleties that the simulator doesn't capture perfectly. Slightly different lag in the control response, slightly different feel of the thrusters, slightly different visual cues through the windows. The test pilots on the crew are there specifically to evaluate and characterize these differences. Communications during the cruise are conducted through the Deep Space Network. The crew speaks with mission control every day in scheduled communication passes that cover both technical status updates and personal communications. Family calls, video messages from ground teams. The communication latency is small during the transit to the moon. The moon is only about 1.3 light seconds away, so the round-trip communication delay is less than 3 seconds. At this distance, conversations are essentially real-time. This is qualitatively different from what the crew will experience on future missions to Mars, where the communication delay can reach 24 minutes one way, making real-time conversation impossible. Day 4 brings the lunar approach. As Orion approaches the moon, the lunar surface fills an increasing portion of the windows, from a dot in the distance to a world spanning the entire field of view. The gravitational pull of the moon increases, and Orion begins its swing-by trajectory. The crew on Artemis II will see something that only 24 human beings have ever seen: the lunar surface from close range, with their own eyes through a window. Every crater, every ray system, every lava plain that generations of geologists have studied from Earth through telescopes, they are looking at it from a distance of 8,900 kilometers. The far side passage is the defining moment of the mission. As Orion passes behind the moon, the Earth disappears from the windows, and the comm signal goes silent. For approximately 25 minutes, the crew is completely out of contact with Earth, in the most remote location any human being has occupied since the Apollo era. The astronauts on Apollo described this moment: the silence of the far side, the star field visible in a way it never is from Earth, the black void of space overhead without any blue atmosphere to soften it, as one of the most profound experiences of their lives. The crew of Artemis II will experience it again for the first time in 52 years. When Orion emerges from behind the moon and the comm signal reacquires, the crew will have just experienced something worth trying to describe. The view of Earth from lunar distance that only 24 people have ever seen. The Earth at 370,000 kilometers is not the blue marble of photographs taken from low Earth orbit. It is smaller. It fits within the palm of your hand at arm's length. It is recognizably the Earth, the blue of the oceans, the white of the clouds, the brown and green of the continents visible in between. But it is small enough and distant enough that the enormity of the distance is not abstract. You are looking at a sphere. You are looking at a specific object in space. You are not on it. The psychologists who have studied the cognitive and emotional effects of this view on Apollo, astronauts described a phenomenon they called the overview effect. A sudden, visceral understanding of the fragility and the beauty of the Earth as a specific place in a much larger cosmos, accompanied in some cases by a shift in perspective on the relative importance of the conflicts and divisions that occupy most of human attention from the surface. Not every astronaut reports the overview effect. Not every Apollo astronaut described a transformative experience, but enough did, with enough consistency that the phenomenon is real and well documented. The crew of Artemis II will be the first people in 52 years to look at the Earth from that distance. What they will carry back from that view, in their memories, in their subsequent testimony, in whatever they choose to say and write and communicate about it, will be one of the most valuable byproducts of the mission. Not scientifically, not operationally, but humanly, in the specific sense that the account of what it is like to be that far from Earth, told by people who have been there, changes what it is to be a person who has not. When Orion emerges from behind the moon and the comm signal reacquires, Houston will be watching for any anomalies in the telemetry that accumulated during the blackout. The spacecraft continues on its return trajectory. The moon recedes, Earth grows. The final 2 days of transit home are, in terms of the mission's technical objectives, the inverse of the outbound transit. The crew begins preparing for re-entry, checks the heat shield's thermal conditioning systems, configures the capsule for the re-entry phase, and transitions back into the launch and re-entry suits. Day 10 is re-entry and recovery. The crew enters the atmosphere at approximately 39,500 kilometers per hour. The G-loading during re-entry is lower than during launch, approximately 3 to 4 G, but it lasts longer, approximately 10 minutes of sustained deceleration during the atmospheric braking phase. The skip re-entry profile breaks this into 2 phases with a brief reduction in loading during the skip. The heat shield does its work. The parachutes deploy. The capsule splashes down in the Pacific Ocean. From the moment of splashdown to the moment the crew sets foot on the recovery ship, approximately 3 hours pass. Navy divers from the USS San Diego attach flotation devices to the capsule, open the hatch, pass in fresh suits, and assist the crew in exiting. The crew will have been in microgravity for 9 days, and their legs will not work properly. They will be helped into the recovery ship. They will receive immediate medical evaluation. Their first full gravity meal will be their first real test of how well the body has maintained its capacity after 9 days of weightlessness. The data from that 10-day mission, the telemetry, the crew's physical and psychological assessments, the post-flight inspection of every system on the spacecraft, including the heat shield, will be the most valuable dataset in the history of NASA's human spaceflight program since the Apollo era. It is the data that will determine what comes next. Chapter 9. What changes? If Artemis II works. When Artemis II succeeds, when Orion brings 4 crew members home safely from the moon, several things change simultaneously in ways that ripple through the program, through NASA's institutional credibility, and through the broader landscape of human spaceflight. The most immediate change is technical. A successful Artemis II with a heat shield that performs as the modified trajectory design predicted removes the largest single uncertainty from the crewed lunar landing program. The heat shield is the one system on Orion that cannot be redundant. It cannot have a backup, because a backup would require a second heat shield on the same capsule, which is physically impossible. It is the one system where failure during the most critical phase of the mission is unrecoverable. If Artemis II's heat shield performs correctly, the engineering team can move forward with the Artemis III, planning on the basis of validated heat shield performance under crewed conditions and the modified re-entry profile. If it does not, if another unexpected anomaly appears, the program faces another round of investigation and redesign before any crewed lunar landing can occur. The second change is institutional. NASA has not successfully completed a crewed beyond LEO mission since 1972. In the intervening 52 years, the agency has done extraordinary work. The Space Shuttle program's 135 flights, the construction and continuous habitation of the International Space Station, the robotic exploration of the solar system, the development of the James Webb Space Telescope, but the specific capability of safely sending humans beyond low Earth orbit and returning them, the capability that defines the hardest tier of human spaceflight, has been dormant. Every generation of NASA personnel since the early 1970s has worked in an agency that did not have that capability operationally. A successful Artemis II restores it, and with it restores the institutional confidence. The knowledge that the capability is real and current, not historical. This institutional confidence matters beyond the next mission. NASA's ability to recruit and retain the talent it needs, to sustain the political support it requires, to build the international partnerships it depends on, all depend on the credibility that comes from demonstrated capability. The Artemis program has spent years making promises about what it will do. Artemis II is the first crewed demonstration. A successful mission converts those promises into evidence. The third change is geopolitical. A successful Artemis II, followed by the schedule of subsequent missions, positions the United States to land at the lunar South Pole before China in the most likely scenario. This position is not just about the prestige of being first. It is about the strategic realities of cislunar space that we discussed in the previous chapter. A demonstration of American operational capability in cislunar space strengthens the hand of the Artemis Accords coalition, makes the American-led framework for responsible lunar operations the operative one, and creates the facts on the ground that shape the evolving legal and governance framework for the moon. The fourth change is commercial. A successful Artemis II validates the architecture in which Orion serves as the crew vehicle and SpaceX Starship serves as the human landing system. If Artemis II succeeds and Starship demonstrates HLS capability on schedule, the path to Artemis III is clear. If Artemis II succeeds, but Starship's HLS development continues to face challenges, NASA will have the option of accelerating Blue Origin's Blue Moon lander as an alternative. The success of Artemis II effectively creates a market, a demonstrated demand for commercial lunar lander services that has operational timelines attached to it, that gives both SpaceX and Blue Origin concrete targets to hit. The fifth change is cultural. A successful Artemis II returns human beings to the vicinity of the moon, with a crew that includes the first Black astronaut beyond LEO, the first woman to the moon, and the first non-American beyond LEO. The cultural significance of this cannot be quantified, but it cannot be dismissed. Every generation of children born after Artemis II will grow up in a world where it is an established fact that space exploration belongs to a broader slice of humanity than it did in the Apollo era. The role of representation in shaping who pursues careers in space exploration is not hypothetical. It operates through the very direct mechanism of young people, seeing people who look like them, doing things they might aspire to, and deciding that those things are possible for them. The institutional confidence dimension of a successful Artemis II extends into the specific mechanics of how NASA's budget is defended in Congress. The appropriations committees that control NASA's annual budget funding are not, in the main, composed of people with deep technical understanding of spaceflight. They are legislators who make allocation decisions based on a combination of constituent interest, industrial policy goals, and their overall assessment of whether a program is delivering results against the resources it receives. For the past decade, the Artemis program's relationship with its congressional overseers has been characterized by a cycle of delay, cost growth, and program restructuring that has strained that relationship. The program has repeatedly promised timelines it did not meet and budgets it could not hold. A successful Artemis II breaks this cycle in a visible, undeniable way. You cannot argue with a successful, crewed lunar flyby. You cannot reinterpret it as a partial success or a qualified achievement. The crew either comes home safely from the moon or they don't. If they do, and specifically, if the heat shield performs correctly, if the communications work, if all the systems the program has spent $20 billion developing do what they were designed to do, it is a straightforward success that the program can point to in every subsequent budget negotiation. It changes the terms of the conversation from "we are planning to do this" to "we have done this, and we are planning to do the next step." That is a very different position to be in, and every subsequent mission, Artemis III's crewed landing, the Gateway assembly, the sustained South Pole operations, benefits from the credibility established by Artemis II. What does not change with a successful Artemis II is everything that still needs to be done. Artemis II is not the moon landing. It is the precursor, the demonstration that the first element of the architecture works. The Starship HLS still needs to demonstrate crewed lunar landing capability. The near rectilinear halo orbit rendezvous procedure still needs to be perfected. The lunar South Pole surface operations still need to be planned in detail. The lunar gateway still needs to be assembled. The life support systems for extended surface stays still need to be qualified. The road from Artemis II to a sustainable human presence at the lunar South Pole is long, and Artemis II is the first step on it, not the last. But the first step is the one that has been missing for 52 years, and taking it changes everything. Chapter 10, The Long Game, Why the Moon is Just the Beginning. The Artemis program is not the end goal. It is not even the penultimate goal. The moon is a destination, but it is also infrastructure, a proving ground, a development environment, a source of resources, and a stepping stone toward something much further away. NASA's stated long-term goal is to establish a sustained presence at the lunar South Pole, a permanent or semi-permanent human outpost from which ongoing scientific research, resource extraction, and technology development can occur. This outpost would be supported by the Lunar Gateway, the small space station in the near rectilinear halo orbit that is being assembled as part of the Artemis architecture. The Gateway is not a self-contained destination. It is a hub, a place to dock crew vehicles, store supplies, park landers, and coordinate surface operations. The resources of the lunar South Pole are the key to making this sustained presence possible. Water ice, confirmed in the permanently shadowed craters by the L-Cross impact experiment in 2009 and further characterized by subsequent orbital measurements, can be extracted, purified, and used as drinking water for crews. More importantly, it can be electrolyzed into hydrogen and oxygen. Liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen are rocket propellants. A facility at the lunar South Pole that can produce rocket propellant from local water ice is a propellant depot that does not require the expensive and difficult business of launching propellant from Earth. Missions that refuel at the lunar depot can carry more payload, travel farther, or require smaller launch vehicles than missions that carry all their propellant from Earth. The economics of this are transformative if they work. The hardest part of going anywhere in the solar system is getting off Earth. The launch cost and a mass penalty for Earth escape velocity is the dominant cost factor in every deep space mission. If a fraction of the propellant for deep space missions can be manufactured on the moon rather than launched from Earth, the effective cost of deep space exploration falls dramatically. This is the logic behind the emphasis on the lunar South Pole as the destination for the first crewed landing rather than the scientifically interesting but resource-poor equatorial regions where Apollo landed. The step beyond the moon is Mars. NASA has been talking about Mars as the ultimate human spaceflight destination since at least the 1960s, when Wernher von Braun published his Mars project concept. Every administration since has, in some form, endorsed Mars as the long-term destination. The specific mechanisms have changed: direct entry to the Mars atmosphere, orbital rendezvous, surface staging, Deimos and Phobos as waypoints. But the destination has remained. The Artemis program's relevance to Mars is partly about the moon's resources and partly about the technologies that must be developed for lunar operations before they can be applied to the much more demanding Martian environment. Life support systems that can sustain crew on the lunar surface for weeks will be further developed for the months-long Mars transit and the extended surface stays that a Mars mission would require. Autonomous systems, spacecraft, surface vehicles, habitats that can operate with reduced crew intervention and communication delay, are essential for Mars, where the round-trip communication delay can reach 48 minutes, and are developed first on the Moon, where the delay is 3 seconds. Propellant production from local resources, the ice at the lunar South Pole, is the precursor technology for the same capability on Mars, where the thin atmosphere contains carbon dioxide that can be combined with hydrogen to produce methane propellant. SpaceX has its own agenda that partially overlaps with and partially supersedes NASA's. Elon Musk has been explicit since the founding of SpaceX that the company's goal is to make humanity a multiplanetary species, specifically by establishing a self-sustaining colony on Mars. The Starship vehicle that SpaceX is developing as NASA's human landing system for Artemis II is the same vehicle that SpaceX intends to use for its own crewed Mars missions. The development of Starship is therefore not solely a function of NASA contracts. It is driven by SpaceX's own commercial and strategic goals, which means NASA gets the benefit of that development investment without paying for all of it. The relationship between NASA's Artemis program and SpaceX's broader ambitions is one of the most interesting dynamics in the history of American spaceflight. The government program and the commercial company are not simply contractor and client. They are, in a real sense, co-investors in the development of a capability, human deep space transportation, that each intends to use for its own purposes. NASA needs Starship to land on the Moon. SpaceX needs the Moon missions as a development test for Starship's crewed deep space capability. The interests converge on the development program, even if the ultimate destinations diverge. The long game is this: the Artemis program builds the infrastructure for regular access to the lunar South Pole, which validates the technologies and proves out the operational concepts for crewed deep space missions. The lunar economy, propellant production, scientific research, eventually tourism and resource extraction, provides the commercial demand that sustains the infrastructure economically without depending entirely on government funding. And the technologies developed for the Moon, combined with the propellant resources available there, make Mars missions economically and operationally feasible in a way that they are not today. One specific technological bridge from lunar operations to Mars that is often underappreciated is the development of autonomous medical capability. On the ISS, medical emergencies can be addressed, imperfectly, by emergency return to Earth within hours. On a mission to the lunar South Pole, the return window is measured in days. On a Mars mission, there is no emergency return at all. The crew must be capable of managing any medical event that occurs during the multi-month transit and the multi-month surface stay, with medical support from Earth consisting only of communication advice from flight surgeons with a 24-minute communication delay. The medical autonomy required for Mars missions: autonomous diagnosis, autonomous surgical capability, comprehensive pharmaceutical stores, autonomous intensive care capability, is developed first at the lunar distance, where the consequences of inadequacy are serious, but the communication delay is manageable. The Artemis program's approach to on-orbit medical capability has evolved significantly from the Apollo era, when astronaut physicians performed medical assessments and the crew managed minor issues themselves. The Artemis program includes dedicated medical training for all crew members. Onboard medical diagnostic equipment that can perform a range of laboratory analyses, telemedicine consultation capability through the DSN, and protocols for a wider range of emergency scenarios than any previous crewed lunar program planned for. This doesn't make the crew independent of Earth for major medical emergencies, but it represents a step toward the medical autonomy that Mars missions will require. None of this follows automatically from Artemis II. It requires Artemis II to succeed, followed by Artemis III, followed by the Gateway, followed by sustained South Pole operations, followed by propellant production demonstration, followed by commercial operators entering the cislunar market, followed by a decade or more of incremental capability development. The chain is long, and every link requires investment and execution. But the chain starts with Artemis II. And if Artemis II does not fly, or flies and fails, the chain does not start. Chapter 11. The Human Cost. What the crew is actually risking. Everything discussed in this video so far has been about hardware, about costs, about politics and strategy and timelines. But the thing at the center of all of it is 4 human beings. And the question that deserves honest engagement, not bureaucratic framing, is what those 4 human beings are actually risking when they climb into Orion. The honest answer requires rejecting the language of program communications, which tend to describe risk in probabilistic terms that sound reassuring without conveying the underlying physical reality. Mission success probability and crew loss of mission probability are useful statistics for program planning. They are not fully adequate for understanding what it means to be a person inside a spacecraft that could fail. Let's be direct. The Orion spacecraft has flown once. The heat shield performed in a way that the models did not predict. The investigation has identified a plausible cause and proposed mitigations, but the mitigations have not been tested in flight. When the crew of Artemis II enters the atmosphere at 39,500 kilometers per hour, the heat shield will be doing something no heat shield has done before in the precise thermal environment of the modified skip re-entry profile. If the heat shield fails, if the char layer ejects in a way that exposes the underlying structure to the thermal environment, the crew will not survive. There is no abort capability at re-entry. There's no recovery mechanism. Re-entry failure is fatal. This is not a hypothetical scenario invented for dramatic effect. It is the actual failure mode of a spacecraft that on its first flight demonstrated unexpected behavior in its most critical system. The probability of this failure mode occurring has been reduced. Through the trajectory modifications, through improved models, through the manufacturing improvements on Orion 004, but it hasn't been reduced to 0. Residual risk remains. The crew knows this. Victor Glover, Christina Koch, Reed Wiseman, and Jeremy Hansen have been through the briefings. They have sat in rooms with the engineers who investigated the anomaly and the engineers who designed the mitigations and the program managers who assessed the residual risk. They have asked the hard questions. They have received the honest answers. And they have signed up anyway. This is not naivety. It is a specific kind of courage that has characterized every test pilot and every astronaut who has climbed into a vehicle at the frontier of what is possible. John Glenn understood what could go wrong with his Mercury capsule's retro rocket package. The telemetry suggested a loose heat shield that might separate during re-entry, and he flew anyway. The Apollo 1 crew, Gus Grissom, Ed White, Roger Chaffee, understood that the capsule's systems had significant problems that had not been fully resolved, and they accepted the risk that ultimately killed them in a launch pad fire during a routine test. The Challenger crew, Francis Scobie, Michael Smith, Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis, Krista McAuliffe, launched on a morning cold enough to compromise the O-ring that NASA's engineers had identified as a concern. The comparison between Artemis II and those tragedies is not meant to suggest that Artemis II will fail as they failed. It is meant to illustrate that the willingness to fly in spite of known residual risk is not something new in the history of spaceflight. It is the baseline condition of test piloting. The question is not whether risk exists, it always does, but whether the risk is understood, whether the mitigations are adequate, and whether the people accepting the risk have made that acceptance with full information. What is genuinely different about Artemis II from the worst failures of the past is the quality of the communication around the risk. NASA's initial public minimization of the heat shield anomaly was a process failure, but the subsequent investigation, the congressional testimony, the Inspector General reports, the formal engineering analysis, the development of specific mitigations, has been conducted at the level of transparency and rigor that the previous failures were not. The crew of Artemis II has more complete information about the specific risks of their mission than the Challenger crew had about their O-ring risk. Whether that information translates into adequate mitigation is the question that only the flight will answer. There is also the physical reality of what the crew will experience that is worth acknowledging, not the catastrophic failure scenarios, but the ordinary accumulation of physical stress that 10 days in deep space imposes on a human body. The launch, G-loads. The adaptation to weightlessness in the first 24 to 48 hours. Nausea, disorientation, the redistribution of body fluids as the cardiovascular system adapts to the absence of gravity. The disruption to sleep from the launch and early mission adrenaline. The confined space, the isolation, the psychological weight of being farther from Earth than any human being in 52 years, knowing that if something goes wrong, there is no rescue coming. These are not reasons not to do it. They are part of the full account of what doing it actually costs. The 4 crew members of Artemis II will return from this mission changed, physically deconditioned in ways that rehabilitation will address, psychologically marked in ways that are harder to predict, and in possession of an experience that no living human being has had. That experience will be scientifically useful, operationally important, and personally transformative in ways that we cannot fully anticipate. The crew will do it because, when they weigh everything, the risk, the physical cost, the psychological demand, the separation from family and friends, and Earth for 10 days at the edge of what any human being has done, they have concluded that the mission is worth it. That is a judgment only they can make. The rest of us can engage with it honestly by understanding what they are actually deciding rather than by abstracting it into probability statistics and program milestones. Chapter 12. The broader significance, 52 years and 1 flight away. The gap between December 1972 And 2026 is not just a gap in American human spaceflight capability. It is a gap in the broader human project of extending the reach of civilization beyond the planet where it originated. Every civilization in human history has eventually pressed at the boundaries of the world it knew. Driven by a combination of curiosity, necessity, resource scarcity, and the simple human impulse that drives people toward the horizon, whether or not the horizon is safe. For 52 years, that impulse, as expressed in the specific capability of sending humans beyond Earth orbit, was dormant. Not because humans were incapable of it. The capability was demonstrated 12 times between 1969 and 1972, but because the political and economic conditions that had funded the original expansion were no longer present after Apollo. The space race ended. The Cold War's urgency faded. The Vietnam War consumed budget and attention, and the political will to invest in space ambitions. The shuttle was designed as a more sustainable and affordable approach to human spaceflight. And it was those things, but it was not a vehicle for going further than low Earth orbit. What made the 52-year gap so long was not technical limitation. It was a failure of sustained purpose. The Saturn V program was canceled while the rockets were still being built. The launch vehicles for 3 planned Apollo missions sat in storage at the Marshall Space Flight Center, never flown, as the program wound down. The knowledge of how to build Saturn V faded from institutional memory. The engineers who built it retired or died. The tooling was scrapped. When NASA eventually needed to build a new heavy-lift rocket for the Artemis program, it could not simply revive the Saturn V. It had to design a new rocket from scratch, using the technology and industrial base that existed in 2011, because the technology and industrial base that built the Saturn V no longer existed. This is the true cost of the 52-year gap, not just the cost of rebuilding capability. The $43 billion for SLS and Orion development, the additional billions for the human landing system and gateway. It is the cost of what was lost and never recovered. The institutional knowledge, the manufacturing infrastructure, the operational experience, the cultural confidence. The Apollo program had, by its end, developed an extraordinary depth of operational experience with crewed deep space missions. That experience was not transferred to a successor program. It evaporated. The Artemis program is not just going back to the moon. It is rebuilding the institutional capability to go back to the moon, from a starting point that is in many ways lower than the starting point of the Apollo program itself. The $20 billion spent on Orion is the price of the gap as much as it is the price of the spacecraft. It is not what it would have cost to develop a lunar crew vehicle in a world where the capability had never been lost. It is what it costs to develop one in a world where the capability was lost for 50 years and had to be rebuilt from scratch, with the institutional disruptions and cost-plus contracting and political whiplash that accompany any program that spans multiple administrations and budget cycles. Understanding this context is important because it shapes what success on Artemis II means. If Artemis II is successful, it is not simply a milestone in a program. It is the restoration of a capability that was allowed to lapse, the proof that the institutional knowledge can be rebuilt even after a 52-year interruption. and the beginning of an era in which the boundary of the human accessible universe is no longer the 400-kilometer shell of low Earth orbit. That would be, in any honest accounting, one of the most significant events in the history of the human species. Not because going around the moon is in itself transformative. It is not a landing. It is not a colony. It is not the beginning of a new civilization. But because it demonstrates that the capability to go beyond Earth orbit is again real, again operational, again sustainable, and pointed toward everything that lies beyond the moon. Mars, the asteroids, the outer planets, the solar system as a whole. The question of whether humanity should extend its presence beyond Earth, whether it is wise, whether it is the right use of resources, whether the money would be better spent on problems on the surface of the planet, is a legitimate question and a genuinely difficult one. The $93 billion projected total cost of the first Artemis crewed landing could fund enormous investments in climate science, global health, poverty reduction, or any number of other priorities. There is no obvious right answer to the question of how resources should be allocated between space exploration and terrestrial needs. There is a specific dimension of the 52-year gap that tends to be invisible because it operates at the level of lived experience rather than program documentation. Every engineer, every mission controller, every flight director, every program manager who worked on Artemis II has spent their career in an agency that did not have the capability they were trying to rebuild. They have studied the Apollo program in archives and textbooks. They have interviewed the surviving veterans. They have tried to reconstruct what the people who did this before knew and how they knew it. But there is a difference between knowledge transmitted through documentation and knowledge transmitted through experience. The people who planned and executed Apollo had never done it before. Apollo was new to them too, but they had the benefit of working in an institutional culture that was in the middle of doing it, where the lessons of each mission were immediately incorporated into the planning of the next. The people building Artemis inherited an institutional culture that had been in lunar planning mode for 15 years but had never executed a crewed lunar mission. The gap between planning and execution is where most of the surprises live, and the Artemis team is encountering those surprises without the accumulated buffer of operational experience that Apollo's teams built mission by mission. This is one of the reasons why the Artemis II crew's role as test pilots and evaluators is so important. The data they bring back, not just the telemetry and the hardware inspection data, but the crew's own experiential account of how the vehicle behaved, how the communications felt at lunar distances, what the far side passage was like, how the re-entry loads compared to the simulator, is irreplaceable. It is the experiential data that cannot be generated any other way. It is the beginning of the operational knowledge base that will inform every subsequent Artemis mission, the way each Apollo mission informed the next. But there is a separate question, which is, given that the decision to return to the moon has been made, given that the $20 billion has been spent, given that 4 extraordinary human beings have committed to the mission, is Artemis II capable of succeeding? The answer is yes, with meaningful probability, with residual risk, with the genuine possibility that something unexpected happens as unexpected things have happened in every frontier program in the history of human spaceflight. But with a spacecraft that was designed with every lesson of 50 years of crewed spaceflight incorporated, with a crew that knows what they are facing, with a mission architecture that builds in multiple abort options and safety margins, and with an engineering team that has spent years preparing specifically for this moment. Conclusion: what this flight actually represents. There are people alive today who watched Neil Armstrong step onto the moon in July 1969. They are in their 70s and 80s now. They have lived their entire adult lives in a world where humans went to the moon. And they have also lived through the 52 years since the last time a human being went beyond Earth orbit. They know what both eras feel like. When Artemis II launches, when the SLS lifts off from Kennedy Space Center with 4 crew members aboard, and the world watches the most powerful rocket on Earth carry human beings beyond the 400-kilometer boundary for the first time since 1972, those people will understand something that the rest of us understand only intellectually. They will understand the magnitude of what was interrupted and the magnitude of what is being restored. For everyone born after 1972, everyone alive today who is younger than about 50, the idea of humans going to the moon has always been history. Something that happened before we were old enough to witness it, preserved in archive footage and the biographies of astronauts who are now old men. The moon shots were extraordinary, but they were not ours. They belonged to a generation that has been waiting with patient frustration for the half-century project of returning to finish what was started. Artemis II is the beginning of that completion. Not the end, not the landing, not the outpost, not the resource extraction, not the Mars mission. Just the beginning. A flyby, a demonstration, a test. 4 people going farther than any human being has gone in 52 years, and coming back. The $20 billion is a real number that represents real choices with real consequences. The choice to build a new rocket from scratch rather than invest in developing commercial alternatives earlier. The choice to use cost. Plus contracting rather than fixed price competition for the prime contracts. The choice to let the capability lapse for 50 years in the first place. Those choices deserve scrutiny and accountability, but the mission itself and the crew deserve something else. The recognition that they are doing something genuinely difficult and genuinely important, in the full knowledge of what the risks are, because they have concluded that it is worth doing. Victor Glover, who is going to travel farther from Earth than any black human being in history, knows what the heat shield did on Artemis I. Christina Koch, who is going to become the first woman to travel to the moon, knows what the Inspector General said about the program's communication of that anomaly. Reed Wiseman, who will command the mission and bear ultimate responsibility for the decisions made in flight, knows the full risk profile in detail that no press release has ever conveyed to the public. Jeremy Hansen, on his first spaceflight, knows he is boarding a spacecraft that has made one previous journey and revealed something unexpected on that journey. They know, and they are going anyway. That is the thing that $20 billion can buy when it is converted into a spacecraft, a rocket, and the 4 human beings who are prepared to fly it. Not a guarantee, not a certainty, not the absence of risk, just the willingness to go. 52 years is a long time to wait for that.